Welcome back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston. If this is your first time here, this is a YouTube channel where we do gear, demos, and reviews, as well as studio tips and tricks for leveling up your writing, playing, and production from the perspective of a guitar player working out of a home studio. If that's the kind of thing that would appeal to you, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button and stick around for future videos. Today we are taking a look at two new releases from Browne Amplification. Browne is one of those companies whose gear I've been playing for years, and their pedals have been mainstays on my live boards in particular for as long as I have had their stuff. Their original offering, the Protein, this is an updated version, not the original, was kind of their first offering and really made them a staple of a lot of people's boards very quickly. This original device is the blue channel on the right, the green channel on the left. The blue side is a modification on a Blues Breaker. The green side is a Noble's ODR1, kind of a classic stacking setup for dual drives that became kind of a standard in a lot of different pedal companies for years to come. That blue side in particular became a favorite for myself and a lot of other people, so much so that when it came time for Browne to kind of iterate upon the stuff that they have made, they brought the Carbon to market, a single enclosure version of just that blue channel with some key updates, including a 3-position toggle knob right here that allows you to kind of like softly roll off a little bit or a little bit more of the very shimmery high end of this device. And it's worth noting that that little toggle switch is a worthwhile update because unlike the original Blues Breaker circuit and a lot of iterations of it over the years, the Carbon makes some pretty significant changes, namely much higher headroom and as a result more volume than your average Blues Breaker circuit, as well as more kind of top-end sheen and articulation, which allows this to be a much more present sounding version of a Blues Breaker circuit with the ability to kind of tame that back when you need it to. And all of that is what I think is just kind of necessary context for the first pedal we are talking about today, which is the Browne Carbon X. As the name might imply, this is two carbons in one enclosure, with the left channel being a full standalone Carbon taking the place of the green channel Noble's style overdrive. However, there's an additional twist here. As you can see, if you look closely, you've got that 3-position toggle on that left channel, but none on the right. And that's because when developing this circuit, the goal was not to just put two identical Carbons in a device and run them in series, but rather to kind of optimize that first channel for running into the second one. And so what Browne has done here is brought back some of the kind of like old school DNA of a Blues Breaker in that first circuit, a little bit darker, a little, just a hair less of that shine, but also less headroom and by proxy, less volume. So you can compensate obviously with your level control, but as you push level and tone on that first circuit, it is not going to bloom both volume and articulation and clarity in the same ways that their kind of like flagship version of the circuit on the left channel will. And at this point, it's worth noting, if you want a really focused dive on the Carbon circuit on its own, I will link that down below and in a card right somewhere in the corner here. I have covered that on the channel before. This, however, is its entirely own thing because this right channel is a version of the Carbon that doesn't exist in any other version of this device. And the consequences become a little bit interesting. You have something on the right here that shares more DNA with a classic Blues Breaker, and by proxy, kind of shares some similar DNA both in terms of broad strokes and specificity to that channel with something like a King of Tone or probably a Duelist. I haven't played one, but I assume it's kind of doing a similar thing. The dual Blues Breaker box is well-worn territory at this point, and the idea that you have kind of a more classic breaker on one side and a more modern, modified version on the other is a very welcome thing. I've had this pedal for several months now. I have not done a focused demo on it, but you will have seen it pop up a lot on the channel, and I have used it a ton kind of in all contexts since it got here because it kind of does exactly what I want something like this to do, including being something that has been on almost every live board I've made in the last year. Moving on, however, to the other piece of gear that we are taking a look at in this video, we have the Sky Snake Attack Chorus. We're going to call it SSHAC because, like, why? This is a fully analog Bucket Brigade chorus vibrato. and has some really specific qualities to its waveform and its feature set that I think are worth knowing about. This is a mono-in, stereo-out analog chorus with an interesting twist. Typically when you see like a CE2 or kind of classic Boss-style original stereo choruses, what you get is either a single knob for amount of chorus or a kind of two-band rate and depth with the ability to send dry out one side and wet out the other. This is still the case for this version of chorus. However, you still have a blend control in the middle, and that allows you to run this thing in mono with the ability to kind of use it as a traditional three-knob chorus. But also, if you're going to run it in a mono-in stereo-out configuration, you can either do it in the very classic way that you typically would use for a mono-in stereo-out classic Boss-style chorus, which is dual mono amplifiers basically stacking on top of each other in the mix, or a very classic wet-dry setup. And you achieve that by taking the blend all the way to its minimum and basically having all vibrato on one side, all dry on the other, and then just blending those amps together in your mix. But because you have this blend control, you can actually use it in a left-right configuration and slowly create a progressively wider sense of chorus in a very interesting and unique way by turning that blend up. The character of the chorus itself is incredibly warm and vintage sounding, with a decent but not excessive amount of high filtering being done to the signal so that you basically have zero clock noise in the circuit itself. The shape of the waveform is really interesting. If you've ever played like a tremolo pedal that has a duty control on it that kind of allows you to kind of sharpen up the top of a waveform to give it a little bit more punch at its highest setting, I have a little bit of a feeling that this is what that sounds like in this device. It doesn't feel like a super liquidy style vintage chorus pedal. It instead has something that reminds me a lot more of a more punctuating sound, which I think is probably where the name comes from. Obviously, having homages to the kind of sound of helicopter blades going built into that excessive name. And I think that's a noteworthy image being conjured by the sound because, yeah, there is a punchiness to this chorus that can be obfuscated by bringing that speed nice and low and that depth nice and low. But when you want to lean in, this thing has a lot of kick to it in a really, really wonderful way. And it's also worth noting that one of the other really great modern amenities to the SSHAC is a really wide frequency response range. So we are going to demo this thing out as a mono chorus on the board. We're going to take a brief look at it in a stereo context, and then we're also going to throw it on the bass board and hear it with a bass guitar running through it as well, just so you can hear that it holds up really well to modulating low frequencies as well as it does your kind of more traditional guitar applications. So let's get these back on the board and let's give the SSHAC and the Carbon X a listen. As always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we are working in. I'm playing my Fender 52 reissue Telecaster into the 29 pedals Una, the Origin Effects Cali 76, the Browne Amplification Carbon X and SSHAC into the Strymon LCAP and the UA Delverb. We're running into our amplifier, which is the Benson Monarch Plus with just a little bit of spring reverb, into the Universal Audio aux box and the Warm Audio 273 EQ preamp. We are recording into Universal Audio's Luna. This is our clean tone. So let's start by taking a look at the Carbon X. We have, of course, all knobs pretty much at noon on both channels. And I think the easiest thing here is to start things off by comparing and contrasting the kind of knobs at noon setting of both of these before getting into kind of their relative strengths as devices. So let's go ahead and hear kind of the right channel or first channel and then the second channel or left channel knobs at noon. So as you can hear, the kind of standout differences are going to be more treble and more volume on the second channel. And that is, like we discussed earlier, because this is the actual Carbon V3, whereas this is something more aligned with an original Bluesbreaker style circuit, which are going to have less kind of treble by definition, as well as a little bit less volume coming out of that level control. So to kind of like level match and to kind of make them sound the same, let's go ahead and play with level and tone just to see how close we can get these two devices to each other. So now that we've looked at the two of those devices side by side, let's go ahead and kind of play into their relative strengths, starting by taking a look at the kind of min-max of everything on the first channel, the right side of the pedal. And just for fun, let's go ahead and compare and contrast those exact same settings right here. So once again, as you can hear, there's a difference in the amount of kind of like teeth in the amount of treble between the two of these, which is also why this channel has that additional switch right here, which is going to be a little bit of a treble cut, allowing you to kind of like brighten up your tone and then kind of like roll off just some like kind of key top end. Which is handy because it's a pretty subtle amount of high cut, but as we get into what we're about to do, which is stacking the two of these together, it can come in really helpful for kind of taming down. If you're pushing kind of like a decent amount of treble through both channels, this can be great for making sure that doesn't get totally blown out. So let's look at some ways that you can stack the two of these together while still having them be pretty like rock solid on their own kind of standalone drive sounds. So let's give ourselves kind of a good like medium to high gain and a good like low gain preamp on the first channel. So let's go ahead and bring in a little bit of dotted eighth delay. just a hair of high cut to keep that from getting too washy in a mix. No high cut. Slight high cut. More aggressive high cut. And what's great about that is it kind of reacts to the amount of volume you're pushing through it. So like, we're not losing clarity on this side by itself. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the SSHAC. And same kind of approach. We're going to start with knobs at noon. We have it set up in a mono configuration right now because we're running into the front of the amp. And I also think that this is probably the most straightforward, common use case for an analog chorus vibrato like this. And as such, we have things set up so we're running into the mono input on it, and out of the wet output on it, you would use the dry as basically your stereo send if you are setting it up in a stereo environment, which we will later. So let's go ahead and give it a listen, knobs at noon, and then we will start walking through the blend control to get it to more of a straight up vibrato, as well as hear some of the kind of like min-maxes of the range. As you can hear, we're dealing with a very full range, shimmery chorus, but there's some really cool things with this one in particular. One is because this is a fully analog chorus vibrato, as you kind of dial all the way down to full wet, and it's worth noting that this blend, because you're using the wet output, this is going to be all the way affected audio, and then the max is actually going to be your fully dry. So here at fully blended counterclockwise, you have your vibrato. But there's some really cool things here. Like one is, even if you take everything all the way down, you'll notice that you get a warmer, kind of softer sound, and that is because there's a little bit of treble filtering happening to make sure that there's no clock noise in the analog circuit. Another cool one is at really, really low settings, you can actually get something that sounds a lot more like flanging than chorus or vibrato. And then you get into really, really lush chorus sounds. I'm always a fan of a low and slow chorus. And let's contextualize that a little bit. Let's give ourselves a nice long delay trail, some washy lexicon style reverb, and some compression. So we'll go ahead and wrap up our look at this chorus pedal by taking a look at it in a stereo context. Now, typically speaking, when it comes to these wet-dry stereo choruses that are mono in and then dry and wet outputs, the goal is not typically to run them in a left-right stereo environment. The goal is typically to run them as kind of like wet-dry amp setups where you blend your wet channel with your dry channel in a still ostensibly mono configuration. However, because you have a blend control here and you're not simply sending your wet signal to one device and your dry to the other, but blending the dry signal into the wet on the opposite side, there are some interesting stereo complications available here. So let's go ahead and give our dry tone a listen. Turn this on with blend set so that the wet channel is also sending dry, and then pay attention to kind of how the signal morphs as we modify that blend. So obviously we are losing a little bit of treble information on that wet channel, which we know is going to happen because that is how the clock filtering is happening on the analog circuit. But there's an interesting consequence that you can kind of hear right as you cross across noon right there, where the stereo image of the device really starts to kind of snap into focus.